I'm curious about how many of you who are here or who are online have been to one of our general assemblies, either in person or online. Wow, it's a good number here. I can't see on screen, but wow, it's the majority of folks here. I know we had 18 people in 2018 from this congregation attend, and we've had several over the past few years, which unfortunately have been online. Our General Assembly has historically had a wide range of activities, including workshops on church systems and fundraising, action and justice, emerging movements within the Unitarian Universalist Association. We have business meetings where delegates get to vote on policy and workings of the association. And there's also worship times, sometimes several times a day, and dance parties and some public witness event connecting to the local community. And there's the Ware Lecture, an opportunity for all in attendance to hear from a powerful voice of our time. Speakers have included theologians and poets, authors and educators, change makers and social justice champions. Last year, Georgia voting rights powerhouse Stacey Abrams and Desmond Meade, the author of Let My People Vote, My Battle to Restore the Rights of Returning Citizens, were our online speakers. So I'd like to take you back to 1966, about the time of the story that Diana read today. Imagine being in an auditorium in Hollywood, Florida, with hundreds of Unitarian Universalists when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is introduced and addresses the assembly. The title of his speech was "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." He opened his lecture with the context of his remarks. He said, "I'm sure that each of you has read the arresting little story from the pen of Washington Irving titled Rip Van Winkle. One thing that we usually remember of the story is that he slept 20 years. But there's another point in that story which is almost always completely overlooked. It is the sign on the inn of the little town of Hudson from which Rip went up the mountains for his long sleep. When he went up, the sign had a picture of King George III of England. And when he came down, the sign had a picture of George Washington, the first president of the United States. When Rip Van Winkle looked up at that picture of George Washington, he was amazed. He was completely lost. He knew not who he was. This incident reveals to us that the most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not merely that he slept for 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. While he was peacefully snoring up in the mountains, a revolution was taking place in the world that would alter the face of human history. Yet Rip knew nothing of it. He was asleep. King continued, "One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There's nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution." King named the progress made in the civil rights during his lifetime, but he also saw the need to provoke action from this UU audience. King says, "We see it in our own nation, in the struggle against racial segregation and discrimination, and as we notice the struggle, we are aware of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our midst." He says, Victor Hugo once said that there is nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come. The idea whose time has come today, he said, is the idea of freedom and human dignity. And so all over the world, we see something of freedom, explosion, and this reveals to us that we are in the midst of revolutionary times. An older order is passing away, and a new order is coming into being. How those words have rung true in my heart in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd right here, when the Black voices and rage community and our history rose up in the center of the public eye. The top sellers in 2020 were our own Unitarian Universalist publishers Beacon Press's book, White Fragility, by Robin DiAngelo, with How to Be an Anti-Racist. So you want to talk about race, me and white supremacy, and Between the World and Me, all in the top 8 bestsellers. It felt like we were on the precipice of a new order and that we had made another quantum leap in terms of confronting race and systemic white supremacy in our country. A new president was elected. Biden's inaugural speech denounced racism and nativism, fear, and demonization. There we go. Which he said propelled the January 6th insurrection. He continued, a cry for racial justice some 400 years in the making moves us, a cry that can't be any more desperate or any more clear. And now, a rise of political extremism, white supremacy, and domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat. Yes, yes, yes. That day the nation was introduced to Amanda Gorman, the National Youth Poet Laureate. Hope sprang from our television sets and radios. A sigh of relief was heard by those of us who hold UU principles as our core guidelines and values in our lives. And then COVID continued. Our isolation, our weariness, our constant decision-making about what we should or shouldn't do beyond our homes continued. I don't know about you, but the apathy and the dull edge of daily living has torn away at some of my hope and imagination. Political and community organizing all moved to online. Educational opportunities and rallies became virtual, and the flatness of that experience only grew throughout time. I am really grateful that so many of you stuck with us in this virtual world, and I really miss those who did not. But it feels like as the months went by, hope and joy reversed into disbelief and grief and despair. We watched the big lie take hold, and legislators who once voted on the side of democracy were lulled by the division and falsehoods. Now, the months and years ahead feel unimaginable and frightening. It feels like there's a revolution in our midst, but unfortunately it feels like it's not ours. In his letter from the 1963 letter from the Birmingham jail, King wrote, "More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used their time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. More and more, I feel the people of ill will have used the time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill." Ouch. He followed that sentence with, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." On a local and state level, people of ill will have worked diligently over these past years to destroy the fabric of our democracy. Many of you and I have been struggling with what actions can we take, what actions would actually make a difference. It's as if we've woken from a sleep and are still trying to figure out who the new guy on the sign at the inn is. How did it change from Biden to some evil force with such whiplash? I believe that many of us spend more time focused on those voices we deeply oppose than those voices who are people and organizations who have insight and courage. There are still so many, the majority actually, who have not given up on democracy. There are still people and organizations working every day to tear down white supremacy. There's individuals who continue to serve the greater good by holding public office, by showing up at influential meetings and rallies, by voicing their opinions through calls or letters to influencers in the public sphere and on social media and in printed media. But I believe we're distracted by those who are the loudest, those who pump fear and hatred and division into our households and our minds and our hearts daily. We are all wise enough to know that what we feed gets stronger. Michelle Yu from the website Tiny Buddha says, "Negative thoughts drain you of energy and keep you from being in the present moment. The more you give in to your negative thoughts, the stronger they become." I like the imagery of a small ball rolling along the ground, she says, and as it rolls, it gets bigger and faster. That's what one small negative thought can turn into, a huge speeding ball of ugliness. On the contrary, a small positive thought can have the same effect. As it rolls, it becomes bigger and faster, and it effectively blossoms into a beautiful outcome. The author reminds us that staying positive takes both practice and action. In a list of 10 things to do to confront negative thoughts, she talks about helping someone or doing what she calls stop playing victim and instead create a life through which taking responsibility is a priority. And I really feel like that victim, I don't use that in terms of one's personal life per se. I'm thinking more in terms of this wider revolution that we are, lying down and playing possum because we don't know what to do. She also, of course, talks about practices such as yoga and smiling, doing more joyful things, and naming gratitudes as other elements that can help turn our spirits from negative lethargy to interacting with oneself and the world in a more positive way. I honestly wish I could say that as your minister, I've led the way to greater engagement, but if there's any time that I have felt the realities of my limitations, this is it. Beyond my role as a minister, a mom, a neighbor, a member of the queer community, a resident of the Twin Cities, a woman, a daughter, and a sibling, I am haunted by the time that has passed and how effectively the people of ill will have used their time. But as long as we are alive, time continues, and we still have a role to play in the future. We've seen other vicious backlashes in American history. King popularized the saying of organizing, saying that arc of moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. I often have that mantra of just as long as I have breath, that hymn of ours that helps me shake off my discouragement and my apathy. It goes, just as long as I have breath, I must answer yes to life. Though with pain I make my way, still with hope I meet each day. And the next verse says, just as long as vision lasts, I must answer yes to truth in my dream and in my dark, always that elusive spark. And the last verse is, just as long as my heart beats, I must answer yes to love. Disappointment pierced me through. Still, I kept on loving you. If they ask what I did best, tell them I said yes to love. The love and the you in this song speaks of not romantic love. It's that love that King described as agape. I changed the language in his quote from men to people in this quote that I took from his sermon called Loving Your Enemies, which he preached at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama in 1958. He says, agape is something of the understanding, creative, and redemptive goodwill for all people. It is a love that seeks nothing in return. It is an overflowing love. It's what theologians would call the love of God working in people's lives. King was a man who often called out our interrelatedness. He understood how, as he said, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of all reality. Amen. At the beginning of his lecture remarks, he said this of Unitarian Universalists: in many ways, and for a long time now, we have worked together in a very meaningful way. I want to express my personal appreciation for your support, and let me say that this has been of inestimable value in our continuance of our humble efforts. And then he turned to the audience and he named a list of responsibilities of the church, our churches, that stand as a moral guardian of community and society. He said, I'm sure you will all agree that the church has a major role to play in this period of social change. I would like to suggest some of the things that the church must continually do in order to stay awake through this revolution. So here's the list. I'm just doing the bullet point parts of it. There's not time to go into details. You can always look up his Where lecture online if you want to read more. First, we are challenged to instill within the people of the congregation a world perspective. The world in which we live is geographically one. Now more than ever, we are challenged to make it one in terms of brotherhood. Secondly, he says that the church needs to reaffirm over and over the essential immorality of segregation. He said we must make it clear that segregation, whether it's in public schools or in housing or in recreation facilities or in the church itself, is morally wrong and sinful. It's not only sociologically untenable or politically unsound or merely economically unwise. It is morally wrong and sinful. Next is for the church to move out into the arena of social action. It's not enough for the church to work in the ideological realm and to clear up misguided ideas. To remain awake through this social revolution, the church must engage in strong action programs to get rid of the last vestiges of segregation and discrimination. And he speaks of influencing legislation, call your senators, everybody, and mobilizing community support so that legislation will pass. And once legislation has passed, the church should go all out, he says, to see that legislation becomes a reality and that it's vigorously enforced once it exists. There's so much more in his lecture and his vision for what churches could do to bring around a world of greater justice, but he finished his address with these words that sound like it could have been spoken today. King says, "Let me say in conclusion, I have not despaired of the future. I believe firmly we can solve this problem. I know that there are still difficult days ahead, and these days and they are days of glorious opportunity. Our goal for America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America." I love his words. He's got so much good stuff that he's written and said. I have to admit that as I approach this Sunday, a Sunday which acts as a barometer of the health of our nation when it comes to racism and white supremacy, I had a heaviness in my heart this week. We often turn to heroes like King to inspire us and remind us of the path to justice, but the words he shared with us in 1966 were a call to action. And action is required of us, those of us of goodwill who believe that justice and equity, and those who believe in our interconnectedness. One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a period of great change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. What attitude and outlook is going to carry us through this time? How do we combat the feelings that hold us back from life and engagement? How can this church and these people help hold and guide us towards creating beloved community that expands beyond our congregation? In Faith and Fury, Amanda Gorman speaks words that call us out and into the world. She is a contemporary voice, a young woman, one of the children who reminded us of the future of our country, a country that's worth fighting for. She says, you'll be told this is not your problem, not your problem. You'll be told that now is not the time for change to begin, told that we cannot win. But the point of protest isn't winning, it's holding fast to the promise of freedom, even when fast victory is not promised. She continues, by now we understand that white supremacy and the despair it demands are as destructive as any disease. So when you're told that your rage is reactionary, remind yourself that your rage is our right. It teaches us it's time to fight in the face of injustice. Not only is anger natural, but necessary, because it helps carry us to our destination. Whether we prevail or not, whether we prevail is not determined not only by the challenges that are present, but by the change that's possible. And though we are unstoppable, if we ever feel we might fail, if we be fatigued and frail, when our fire can no longer be fueled by fury, we will be fortified by this faith. Found in the new anthem in the vow, Black Lives Matter no matter what. Black lives are worth living, worth defending, worth every struggle. We owe it to the fallen to fight, but we owe it to ourselves to never stay kneeling when the day calls us to stand. Together we envision a land that is liberated, not lawless. We create a future that is free, not flawless. Again and again, over and over, we will stride up every mountainside, magnanimous and modest. We will be protected and served by a force that is honored and honest. This is more than protest. It's a promise. So with the time we have in our service, which is just a few minutes, I'd love to hear what are some of your dreams for our country and our world that can help shake you out of complacency. If there's those moments you sort of see it, I want you to step away from today for a moment and imagine that you wake up after a revolution filled with love, not the workings of reactionary, ill-willed people who are trying to take our country back in time. I'd love you to share the times or the moments when you feel hope or progress or change for the better compared to what used to be. We know we have work to do, but unless we can envision a world worth working towards, we will be paralyzed by the negative actions of the present. So what are your dreams? And what have you seen that gives you hope? Chad has the mic, and Diana is facilitating online. You must have hope, people.
I heard a wonderful interview this morning on public radio of Dr. King's granddaughter. She is an 8th grader, and she was so eloquent and so determined that her grandfather's work would continue. That really does give me hope. The children of this next generation understand things in ways that we simply did not. And so I do think that that is incredibly important, and everything that we can do to support those children is what we need to be doing.
Thank you, Lynn. It's not their work alone, right? It's our work as well.
Well, maybe Chad can help me out on this, but we were watching, I think, a master class recently, and it was about LBJ and the footage of the lawmakers at that time. It was just so striking how it was just all old white men. And I know we have a long way to go, but it definitely was a very visual representation of there have been many changes.
It didn't help that the footage was in black and white, but wow, was it stark.
You can look at 2016 and who was standing around the president and see much the same. So yes.
Marie, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I want to say that this wonderful slipping on ice incident has made me become more aware of how many good people there are. And I would like to say, especially in this community, I've just been saying that this past week how much I love MSUS, the people here, and how much caring and giving there are. And I know that I wrote a note to myself. I wrote Amanda Gorman's name, and I also wrote call senators. And that's my little way, I guess, of doing things inside the house without going outside and finding more ice. We don't want to do that. But we have such potential just in our community right now. And if we could get all those communities to keep moving forward together. Just imagine, like Reverend Laura was saying, what we could do, you know, with the positive good in our faith and our minds.
Thanks, Marie.
I'm Polly. I dream of a world where trans people, the war on them stops, and that they're celebrated for their self-discovery and not killed anymore.
Thanks, Polly. I've been thinking I listened to a number of podcasts of people of color and a number of queer and trans folks in there, and I just think about even the access we have now to different voices beyond our own, beyond those who sit in a room like this. It's quite phenomenal, and it's like unscreened. It's not packaged up by the media or anybody. It's just people's voices coming directly to us, and I think that's a extraordinary gift of this time. So I dream that that continues, and as you said, Polly, that those people I hear and love in my podcast are no longer targets of hate and injustice, but instead are celebrated and woven deeply into the fabric of this community.
I'm not seeing any other hands online or any comments in chat.
Okay. Thank you all for sharing. Keep dreaming, honestly. Think about that brain chemistry. The more you feed the negativity, that's what comes over you. So keep dreaming. It's not a bad exercise, even though sometimes it might feel a tad bit futile. So